Hello, my name is Adrian Morales. I'm making this video for my Research Methods and Design class. I'm a student in the Master's in Sociology program with the concentration in Criminology at Texas Women's University. My research interests are in workplace deviance, the sociology of work cultures, and the societies these are embedded in. The title of my paper and my presentation poster is Do techniques of neutralization affect the relationship between organizational cronyism and employee retention? And hopefully throughout this video, I'll explain and break down what this all means. So basically, techniques of neutralization are any justifications that people use to explain misbehavior or deviance. And organizational cronyism is a broader term for nepotism, and it's basically favoritism. And employee retention, I define it as the intent to leave an organization. So basically, what I'm asking is when people or employees encounter nepotism in the workplace, do they stay or do they use neutral techniques of neutralization to explain their situation? What is the relationship between techniques of neutralization, uh, nepotism, and employee retention? So here we have my main finding. According to social exchange theory, which is a rational actor model theory and sees individuals as trying to maximize their benefits and minimize their pain, um, it sees them as maximizers. When they encounter unfairness in the workplace, they retaliate by becoming deviant. And this can be either benign, such as withdrawing effort, or it can be more criminal, for example, being aggressive or stealing from the company, to try to balance the imbalanced employee employer relationship, or they just quit. There is a gap not only in nepotism in organizations in the so called developed countries, but there's also a research gap into the internal decision making processes, specifically relating to techniques of neutralization used by those who stay in nepotistic organizations. I also have a QR code that you can scan. It'll take you to my research paper, which I uploaded into a Google Drive account. On the right are all my references, uh, very microscopic, but if you go to the QR code, it takes you to the paper and you can see my references, most of which can be accessed through the TWU's libraries. On the left, we have my intro. So, why should you care as a researcher about nepotism in the workplace or techniques of neutralization, to think about organizational cronyism and employee retention? Well, uh, favoritism in the workplace creates deviance and unequal opportunities. So if you're not a crony, you're losing opportunities. Groups can also influence how you react and constrain your behavior or expand it. What roles do techniques of neutralization have on decision making, especially attrition or leaving the organization? Well, that's what I intend to find out. My methods, I used a mixed methods design. To gather quantitative data, I use Likert scale questionnaires. And to gather qualitative data, I use survey interviews. My population is college employees, including staff, faculty, adjuncts, and lecturers. So you might think that nepotism is just about hiring one's family members. And I have a cartoon to express the idea here. On the lower left, the caption reads, "And this is my newest junior executive, my boy Junior." But it's not just about hiring family members. Nepotism is a broader concept that means hiring either one's family members or friends or acquaintances. But there's an even larger concept or an umbrella term called organizational cronyism that I ran across in the literature. And they measure Nepotism in different ways, but it's basically an umbrella term for favoritism. Favoritism between an employer and an employee that they favor. And it could affect your career ladder, how you get promoted or not, whether you're an in group or an out group. And it can also result in deviance. And I have an image here of people cyber loafing, which is kind of a benign form of uh, deviance in the workplace. And the literature tends to uh, see it as bad because it affects productivity and basically the bottom line. It costs companies money, and it can also lead to companies failing. I was interested in this topic because, for one thing, it's in the popular culture. You might have heard of Nepo babies, which are the successful children of celebrities whose parents, famous names in glittering showbiz connections, have helped them either become celebrities themselves or become very successful in a related career. And here we have a few. We have Tom Hanks with his son, I forget his name, Angelina Jolie and her father, John Boyd, Jaden Smith and his famous parents, Ben Stiller and his famous parents. That's Jerry Stiller, who was in Seinfeld and he was a comedian. And then we have Kate Hudson with her famous parents, Goldie Hawn, and then there's also Kurt Russell. Another reason that I was interested in this is because I've ran into nepotism myself as an employee in various um, organizations, including higher education in the public school system. I'm going to jump around a bit so I can give you some context. I'm going to start with the theoretical perspective. I used three theories. My first theory is social exchange theory, which is one of the most used theory to explore workplace deviant and the employer-employee relationship. So, according to this theory, individuals are rational actors. They're trying to maximize their benefits and minimize their pain. It's an economic model approach to social exchanges between employees and employers, and it has a ton of concepts. One of them has to do, well, two of them have to do with meritocracy. The first one is norm of reciprocity, and it basically says that if you do a favor to somebody, you expect them to return the favor. There's another concept called psychological contract, which is when employees go into an organization, they expect a fair exchange of return for their efforts. They expect to be rewarded for their hard work. When that does not happen, they experience a psychological contract breach, and it's very subjective. They perceive that the employer somehow has broken this agreement, which is like an informal. It's a both informal uh, and formal through your contract, um, and they basically they pay back or return their perceived injury, and it's called negative reciprocity. And what happens is that they withdraw effort, they become lazy, or they become deviant, and this negatively affects the organization. The second theory that I used is techniques of neutralization, which are described as ways of justifying unethical behavior. And there are a set of excuses that individuals turn to when trying to minimize or completely eliminate any guilt, remorse, or shame that may be experienced due to engaging in questionable actions. And the reason I chose it is because workplace deviance, according to social exchange theory, is a type of neutralization. People are justifying acting negatively against your organization, saying, well, my employer didn't reward me as I expected, so I'm going to pay back this injustice by acting either against the interest of the organization or withdrawing effort. The third theory that I use, and it has to do with the qualitative aspects of my paper, whereas the other previous two have to do with the quantitative aspects of my paper, is grounded theory. And it's a bottom up approach. It's a data speaks for itself approach where the researcher would be in the field for an indefinite amount of time and they would interview um, participants uh, of the study for an indefinite amount of time. The interviews at first would be very long, and then eventually they would trickle down to very short interviews. The the researcher is supposed to choose a theory. Glasser and Strauss, 1967, don't really say what theory to choose, but as the researcher goes along, uh, the data they collect would be notes, field notes, documents, and interviews, and then they would create their own theory. It's basically the purpose of this is to generate new theory. So here are my research question and hypotheses. Do techniques of neutralization affect the relationship between organizational cronyism and employee retention? What I'm basically asking here is when employees encounter cronyism in the workplace, favoritism, do they stay on the job or do they leave? Because according to social exchange theory, when this happens, employees leave. But my hypothesis is that they don't leave. They can't afford to leave. So they use techniques of neutralization to explain their situation and stay on the job. Therefore, my research hypothesis is organizational cronyism has a strong positive relationship to neutralization and remaining at work. My null hypothesis is that techniques of neutralization do not affect the relationship between organizational cronyism and employee retention. There's no standard conceptualization of nepotism in the literature review. Some authors distinguish it from cronyism, which is a preference, a favoring of people that you like or acquaintances or friends. Uh, and they see nepotism as strictly hiring of family members, but it's often seen as part of favoritism overall. And there's a larger concept called organizational cronyism, which authors have conceptualized, and they've even made a rubric to operationalize it. And I'm going to show you the one that I'm using to create my own rubric to study this. Um, Nepotism is understudied in developed countries. It has a cultural aspect. For example, in collectivist cultures such as China, Malaysia, Philippines, Greece, and Mexico, it's common. You in those countries, you are taught to respect your elders, to respect authority, to identify with the in group, and you treat your in group better than you do people from out groups. And in individualistic countries, nepotism still exists, but it's based on favors, like an exchange of favors. Uh, Dobos 2017, studying nepotism um, from an ethical stance, sees networking as a type of nepotism or favoritism, and it's a norm in Western countries, and he sees it as unethical, basically, because it gives people an advantage based on likeism, and it doesn't give other people a chance to show uh, their qualifications. Turhan 2014 developed a scale to measure nepotism, which they conceptualized as favoritism, and it's a three-dimensional scale that takes into account cultural aspects. The study group here was teachers in primary school in Turkey. What I found really interesting too is that there's not a lot of research into nepotism in so-called developed countries, organizations in so-called developed countries. Most of the studies that I found are based in collectivist culture, actually. So what Turhan found was that the higher the organizational cronyism, the lower the organizational justice or trust in leaders in the organization. So, uh, I mentioned that the rubric is three dimensions. In group bias has to do with the cultural aspect of collectivism. According to Turhan, in collectivist cultures, people are taught to prefer their in group members. It's called particularism, treating people who are like you better than those who are different. And it has in group bias has to do with the manager subordinate relationship. The next one is paternal cronyism, and that also has to do with collectivist cultural aspects. And this has to do with managers favoring loyal subordinates. And then the third one, reciprocal exchange of favors, is mostly seen in individualistic cultures. And the exchange of favors here is loyalty to the nepotistic manager. So I already mentioned how culture can affect how employees react, and that's the macro level. But at the meso level, you can study work cultures, how work cultures affect employee behavior or deviance. And I found a couple of interesting articles about that. So, for example, Shen et al. 2019 found that in collectivist cultures that have a higher power distance, it's this term that basically refers to one's social acceptance of unequal power relations and the degree to which one obeys authority. So if you obey authority more, you are less likely to react to perceived injustice because those around you don't have the power or are not trained or don't have the cultural expectations to act out as social exchange theory posits that people do act out. So you basically don't have any power. Another article that I found interesting is by Song et al. 2021, and it has to do with cyber loafing. They approach cyber loafing through learning theory, and cyber loafing is basically using the internet for personal uses during work hours, surfing the internet during work hours. And according to them, 30 to 50% of employees do this. This study took place in China. They see this as deviance, um, and it affects the organization. It affects productivity. They don't really assign a dollar amount to the damage done by cyber loafing, but I found it really interesting that what they basically found is that if you see other people cyber loafing, you are more likely to learn to do that yourself. And it has to do with neutralization theory, um, because people take a mindset that says everybody else is doing it, so why can't I? I could not locate academic articles that use social exchange theory and neutralization theory to explain nepotism and workplace deviancy. However, I did find some articles that use neutralization theory to explain workplace deviance, and I found one specifically that has a rubric included in the paper that I want to adapt for my own research. And this one comes from Munoz and Malin, 2019. And what they studied was among salesmen, the relationship between role perception uh, and neutralization to explain unethical sales behavior. So, role perception is conceptualized through three dimensions, and it's basically role conflict, whether they have a loyalty to the customer or to the organization, and it's kind of they're conflicted as to whether they want to serve the customer's best interest or serve their own unethical sales practices. Another dimension is role ambiguity, whether they're uh, clear or unclear on the direction on one's role and the policies and procedures that they should follow. And the third dimension, having to do with role perception, is role efficacy, or how well, um, whether they think how well they can do their job. So, what they found, they had 7 hypotheses, and basically what they found that was that the more ambiguous the role of the salesman, the more unethical they acted, and the more neutralization techniques they used. Also, if they were not familiar with their roles, they also used neutralization techniques mm, to engage in unethical behavior. And basically, what they conclude, these authors, is that employees should not be left alone to figure things out, that they should be trained on policy and procedure and ethics in selling. Another thing that they studied was a relationship orientation. And this basically means that the closer and the longer the relationship to the customer, the more that the salesman um, or salesperson will uh, look after the interests of the customer, and the more trust between the salesman and the customer, and the less deviance, basically. So they used neutralization theory, and there's 5 neutralizations, but basically there it's pretty much infinite because it can be pretty much any excuse. But they outline the 5 main ones in the paper. There's denial of responsibility. So, for example, it's not their responsibility, you know. It was just kind of like the unethical practice is just part of their job. Denial of injury, nobody got hurt. Denial of the victim, no, there's no victim. Condemning the condemners, it's basically it's the victim's fault. And appeal to higher loyalties. So basically, well, I have to look out for my team or for my family. And what they found was that the most impactful justification was condemning the condemners. So basically, blaming the victims. And here is a rubric. If we scroll down to page 70, here's the rubric that they used, and which I'm going to adapt for my own purposes. So now I'm going to discuss a bit about the design and methods. I'm using mixed methods, and my data collection methods are survey questionnaires and Likert scales. Based on the scales that I just showed you, the independent variable is organizational cronyism. That doesn't change. That already has to exist to some extent in an organization. And my setting is a college setting. And the dependent variables are employee retention, which is basically the intention to leave or to stay. And I use that on a scale. And the second dependent variable is techniques of neutralization. And the 3 control variables are years on the job. I think that the more years on the job, the less likely that people will want to leave, even in nepotistic organizations. The numbers outside the organization, I think that this one the might affect one's sense of justice, or because if people have more jobs, they might be used to more. They might just be exposed to more fairness and unfairness, so they might find it easier to identify injustice. And finally, rank and title. I think that the more rank and the higher the title, the less likely people are to leave their positions, even in nepotistic organizations. Here are my survey questions and Likert scales. This was pretty difficult for me, but I try to follow the book, Newman's suggestions, and I hope I got it right. I ask I ask respondents about their behavior, and then, for example, can you recall the last time you were rewarded for your efforts? And then I tie it into the theory, in this case, social exchange theory, the norm of reciprocity, which basically says that people expect a return of favors. And here's one about attitudes, beliefs, and opinions. And they're pretty open ended questions. I ask about the control variables, like what's your rank, how many years have you been on the job, what do they expect out of the opportunities, how do they expect to get promoted, and then we head into the Likert scales, which were adapted from the literature. In this case, uh, organizational cronyism was adapted from a skill developed by Turhan, and it's not verbatim. I did change some parts, but this is what it looks like in group bias, paternal cronyism, and reciprocal exchange of favor, pretty much keeping within Turhan's 3 dimensions. And here's one for neutralization based on the work of Munoz and Malin 2019. And here's the 5 neutralizations. And then finally, I made one to keep with consistency with the measuring tool. And this one is the intention to leave the organization, which is kind of a range of whether they're actively looking, they want to transfer within the organization, or whether they're staying, or whether they're close to retirement. In terms of reflexivity, my main concern would be introducing jargon and terminology that most people don't use relating to social exchange theory, like the norm of reciprocity. Um, Through interviews, it would be interesting to find out whether these norms or these concepts are found in the wild, so to speak, if people have the same concepts for norm of reciprocity or exchange of favors as the theory suggests they do. Jumping back to my research questions, I had to break them up by qualitative versus quantitative. So I have 4 quantitative questions. What is the relationship between organizational cronyism and techniques of neutralization and employee retention? How many and what types of techniques of neutralization determine whether employees leave or remain in nepotistic organizations? 3. Is there a significant difference in employee turnover within nepotistic organizations between people who use techniques of neutralization and those who do not? And 4. To what extent can using techniques of neutralization within nepotistic organizations predict employee retention? As for the qualitative aspects, I have 2 questions. How do people conceptualize and operationalize aspects of social exchange theory uh, through use of field notes and observations such as workplace fairness, unfairness, fair rewards for efforts, workplace withdrawal, group limitations to fighting back, all these things that social exchange theory talks about. Next, how much do employees know about their organizational functions, such as pay scales, chain of command according to organizational charts, procedures relating to hiring, firing, and promotions? And what I'm looking for here is basically whether they're really all observing the same thing as far as nepotism, and whether they they are stuck because of that, or just because they don't know the procedures and how to get promotions. So why is this study important? When I started this research, I thought that nepotism was an isolated occurrence. However, it turns out that it's a universal social norm, that basically when people get together, they form hierarchies. I have a list of other reasons for importance and topics of discussion. For example, are people doomed to deviance in nepotistic organizations? According to social exchange theory, they are. For example, according to Ali et al. 2022, employees who perceive unfairness in the workplace check out mentally or altogether by quitting, or they stay in and engage in irresponsible behavior. In fact, a Lee et al. Study fills a research gap linking organizational cronyism with workplace deviance. The more organizational cronyism, the more organizational deviance, which can be range from benign aspects such as absenteeism to fraud and aggressive behavior. And it also increases organizational cynicism, which are negative moods towards the job and the organization, and counterproductive work behavior, which is they basically define as intentional carelessness because people are just so mentally checked out. However, Cook's article, 2023 article, suggests that in social exchanges, even within nepotistic organizations, there will be an equilibrium. One reason is that people in out groups, if you're in the out group, you're not a crony. You still serve a function. You are still in an exchange relationship, even though you don't have power. You're basically there to make the cronies look good. They look down on you, right? As the out group. And so we should expect some sort of equilibrium of power. And the power here is defined as the exchange of favors or benefits between the manager and the employee. Another thing that I found interesting is who benefits. The perspective of social exchange theorists um, write uh, seemingly for the benefit of the employer through the eyes of the employer, and the employee is seen as kind of a deviant. The main losses to organizations are productivity and efficiency, but there are also losses to individuals, such as loss of opportunities. And the crony is also deviant because they are promoted even though they're not qualified, and thus they are unaccountable, dishonest, and inept, according to Ali et al. 2022. Hudson and Clayson 2017 see nepotism as a scale there's a tipping point where nepotism leads to corruption and social revolution, and they mentioned the French Revolution. However, no author has posited a theory with an empirical chain of events necessary for toppling of organizations or societies due to nepotism. The perspective of individuals as rational actors labels them as greedy, and always trying to maximize their self interests, and does not take into account altruism within groups or other positive learned behaviors within groups.